Good evening from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. I'm Stephen Clark, editor of SpaceflightNow.com. Welcome back to our live coverage for SpaceX's next launch of a Falcon 9 rocket, which is scheduled an hour and 4 minutes and 30 seconds from now at 7:05 p.m. Eastern Time or 23:05 UTC. If you've been following our launch coverage this week, you'll know it's been quite a busy week in U.S. launch activity, with a couple of Falcon 9 rockets having already launched this week. A United Launch Alliance Atlas V rocket lifted off back on Tuesday from here at Cape Canaveral, Florida. And Rocket Lab, another U.S. launch company, launched from their launch site down in New Zealand yesterday. This particular mission is set to loft two Intelsat video broadcasting satellites. These satellites are named Galaxy 33 and Galaxy 34. And they're set to relay cable television and data services across North America, primarily in C-band. These two satellites are stacked one on top of the other inside the payload fairing of the Falcon 9 rocket out on Pad 40. SpaceX had been preparing for launch of this mission back on Thursday night, 2 nights ago, but the countdown was aborted at T-minus 30 seconds when the Falcon 9's onboard computer detected a signature of a small helium leak. The helium on board the Falcon 9 is used to pressurize the propellant tanks and maintain pressure inside those tanks during flight. And there was a data signature that the onboard computer picked up in the final minute of the countdown of a small leak in that helium system, and that automatically triggered an abort at T-minus 30 seconds. SpaceX initially rescheduled the launch for last night on Friday night, but they called off the launch attempt before they started loading propellant into the vehicle and reset for tonight. So far, we believe SpaceX is on track for a launch attempt this evening at 7:05 p.m. Eastern Time or 23:05 UTC. The weather here is near ideal for a launch, with some breezy winds, but well under any sort of launch constraint for a rocket launch. Skies are mostly clear this evening, a few scattered cumulus clouds over the Space Coast. No issue whatsoever with those. And we're setting up, hopefully, to see a launch tonight about 5 minutes after sunset. Sunset here locally is expected around 7 p.m., and around 5 minutes later is when the Falcon 9 launch window opens. Again, there's a 70-minute launch window this evening that extends until 8:15 p.m. Eastern Time. Now, 1 hour, 2 minutes away from the opening of this window for liftoff this evening. We're about less than a half hour away from the expected time of propellant loading. That should get underway at T-minus 35 minutes. And we'll have further updates for you throughout the countdown and the flight this evening. It's about a 38-minute mission from the time of liftoff until payload deployment, until the second of these two satellites actually separates from the launch vehicle in orbit. And we'll be carrying you through the entire countdown and the entire launch sequence this evening. Now inside of 50 minutes until the opening of tonight's launch window here at Cape Canaveral. You're continuing to look at a live view of Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, where SpaceX has a Falcon 9 rocket vertical for liftoff this evening at 7:05 p.m. Eastern Time, or 23:05 UTC, with two commercial communications satellites for Intelsat. These satellites are named Galaxy 33 and Galaxy 34. They're on their way to a geostationary orbit, where they will begin 15-year missions relaying video and data services, primarily for cable television programming across North America. We're less than 15 minutes away from the expected time of propellant loading, when SpaceX will start pumping kerosene and liquid oxygen propellants on board the Falcon 9 rocket. Again, the weather conditions tonight are nearly perfect for a liftoff. Some breezy winds here at Kennedy Space Center, a few miles away from the launch pad where our camera is located and where I'm reporting from this evening. But those winds are well within limits for a rocket launch tonight. And the skies are mostly clear for a twilight launch of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket. T-minus 42 minutes, 40 seconds. So we're about 8 minutes away from the start of propellant loading on board the Falcon 9 rocket. Everything right now is on schedule for launch this evening. Again, the launch window opens at 7:05 p.m. Eastern Time, 23:05 UTC. If you're used to watching SpaceX launches, such as those missions that are carrying Starlink internet satellites or flights heading to the International Space Station with crew or cargo, you'll know that SpaceX typically has instantaneous launch windows for those missions that are targeting specific orbital planes, or in the case of the space station, a rendezvous with the space station. Tonight's mission is a little different. It's carrying up 2 geostationary communications satellites. There's no orbital plane that the launch team needs to worry about intersecting with during this flight, during this launch tonight. So the launch actually has a 70-minute window available this evening. It opens at 7:05 p.m. Eastern Time and runs until 8:15 p.m. Eastern Time. That is 23:05 to 0015 UTC. If you're just joining us, you're watching a live view of Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, where a Falcon 9 rocket is now about 40 minutes from liftoff. Right now, we believe the countdown is right on track for launching at the opening of tonight's launch window at 7:05 p.m. Eastern Time. If you haven't had a chance to do so, please hit the like button here on our YouTube stream. We want as many people watching our coverage as possible. Tonight's launch could be a spectacular one, with the launch window opening just 5 minutes after sunset here locally at Kennedy Space Center and at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. So we expect to see the Falcon 9 climb into sunshine just a few moments after launch. And against a dark sky, that sunshine should illuminate the exhaust plume from the Falcon 9. And we could see what many know as the jellyfish effect of the rocket plume as it climbs into space. The trajectory for tonight's mission is due east, so it'll be heading due east out over the Atlantic Ocean to target the proper orbit for these 2 satellites, which is a geostationary orbit ultimately over the equator. The rocket will actually deploy the satellites into a somewhat lower orbit called a subsynchronous transfer orbit with an apogee or high point several thousand miles above the Earth, but short of geostationary altitude, which is 22,000 miles above the equator. And then the satellites will use their own propulsion to reach their final circular geostationary orbit over the equator. At that altitude, the 2 satellites will actually have an orbital velocity that matches the rate of Earth's rotation. They'll orbit in lockstep with the planet and gives them a fixed geographic coverage zone. In the case of these 2 satellites, their coverage area will be North America. We'll also invite you to please consider joining our YouTube channel. We have different membership tiers available for you to choose from. And if you join it, depending on what level you choose, if you join, you'll gain access to members-only bonus video coverage from our work here on Florida's Space Coast. And this also helps us support our coverage, helps us maintain our coverage of the busy rate of launch activity here on Florida's Space Coast and around the world, both here on YouTube and on our website at spaceflightnow.com.
systems have pulled go for propellant loading and launch. For non-urgent no-go conditions, brief the CE or LD and they'll approve aborting the countdown. For urgent issues affecting the safety of the operation, operators shall call hold on the countdown net. Launch control will abort the launch auto sequence immediately and proceed into the launch abort sequence. At T-minus 10 seconds, launch control will be hands-off, relying on automated abort criteria for the remainder of the count.
Tanks are venting for propellant load.
We're hearing now the voice of members of the SpaceX Launch Control Team as they prepare to start loading propellants into the Falcon 9 rocket. Propellant loading is about a minute away from beginning. That is scheduled to begin at T-minus 35 minutes. So everything right on track right now for launch at 7:05 p.m. Eastern Time or 23:05 UTC.
Launch auto sequence has started.
That call from the SpaceX Launch Control Team is that the launch auto sequence has started, so the countdown is now running off of a ground automated sequencer for this final 35 minutes before liftoff. That will transition to the onboard computer aboard the Falcon 9 rocket itself at T-minus 60 seconds, which will then control the remainder of the countdown. But right now there's a ground automated sequencer controlling the countdown, and this started at T-minus 35 minutes concurrently with the beginning of propellant loading. So SpaceX is now loading about 1 million pounds of kerosene and liquid oxygen into the Falcon 9 rocket. The propellant loading process begins with pumping kerosene and liquid oxygen into the first stage, as well as kerosene fuel into the second stage. And then the liquid oxygen tank, the oxidizer tank on the second stage, will be filled beginning at T-minus 16 minutes. So 3 of the 4 propellant tanks on board the vehicle now being loaded for launch this evening at 7:05 p.m. Eastern Time or 23:05 UTC. T-minus 31 minutes and counting. Again, here's a look at the payloads for tonight's mission. These two satellites are named Galaxy 33 and Galaxy 34. They're owned by Intelsat, which is one of the world's largest operators of geostationary communications satellites. These two satellites are stacked one on top of the other. They were built by Northrop Grumman based on Northrop Grumman's GeoStar satellite bus. Galaxy 33 is on top. It has C-band, Ku-band, and Ka-band payloads. It weighs 8,057 pounds at launch, fully fueled with its chemical propellant supply that it's going to use for in-orbit maneuvers. And it's heading for a position in geostationary orbit at 133 degrees west longitude along the equator. I mentioned geostationary orbit earlier is where the satellites orbit at the same velocity as Earth's rotation, about 22,000 miles over the equator. Galaxy 34 is on the lower position of this dual payload stack. It will separate from the Falcon 9 rocket second during tonight's launch sequence. It has a C-band only payload for video relay services. It's a bit heavier at 8,146 pounds because it actually has some extra structural stiffening to support the load of the satellite on top of it during launch. It's destined for an operating position at 129 degrees west longitude. These two satellites are headed to geostationary orbit, and they are destined to replace two satellites, Galaxy 12 and Galaxy 15, which have been in space for nearly 20 years and are now aging. In the case of Galaxy 15, it is no longer in service. This view is a different angle on the satellites and their dual stacked launch configuration inside SpaceX's payload processing facility here at Cape Canaveral. This view shows the reflector antennas on each of the satellites folded up next to the satellite body to enable it to fit inside the payload fairing of the Falcon 9 rocket. These two satellites, again, destined to launch tonight, hopefully at 7:05 p.m. Eastern Time or 23:05 UTC. We had an opportunity a couple of days ago before the first launch attempt to talk with Jean-Luc Froliger, who is the Senior Vice President for Space Systems at Intelsat. He talked a little bit about this mission, what these two satellites are going to be doing, and also asked him about how Intelsat feels about launching on a SpaceX booster that is actually going to fly for the 14th time tonight, tying a record for SpaceX's reusable rocket fleet. And here are his thoughts on those issues. Okay, Jean-Luc, thanks for joining us for our coverage of the launch of Galaxy 33 and 34. Can you talk a little bit about what these satellites are going to be doing?
So those two satellites, Galaxy 33 and Galaxy 34, are part of our Galaxy fleet covering North America. So they are primarily media satellites. They'll be replacing existing satellites. Galaxy 33 is replacing Galaxy 15. Galaxy 34 is replacing Galaxy 12. Those two satellites are part of a 7 C-band satellites buy that we did in 2020. And those 7 satellites are not only replacing existing Galaxy satellites for our North American media customers, but they're also helping clearing the lower end of the C-band spectrum over the United States. So very, very important satellites for us.
And after launch, after these satellites separate from the Falcon 9 rocket, can you speak to us about what the testing is going to be like, what the orbit raising is going to be like to get those from a subsynchronous transfer orbit to GEO?
Yes, so as you mentioned, those satellites will be placed into a subsynchronous transfer orbit, meaning that the apogee will be lower than the geostationary altitude. So the first thing that will happen is separation from the launch vehicle. Those two satellites are stacked together. So the upper satellite, Galaxy 33, is going to separate from the lower satellites. And then about 8 minutes later, the lower satellites, Galaxy 34, is going to separate from the launch vehicle. Over the next 2 weeks, those satellites will perform a series of maneuvers. First, perigee maneuvers to help increase the apogee height all the way to GEO, and then apogee maneuvers to help increase the perigee height to GEO. Once we are at GEO orbit, we'll deploy reflectors, solar array, and perform in-orbit tests. The first satellite, Galaxy 33, will enter service in early November. The second satellite, Galaxy 34, will enter service in early December.
For those of us who watch cable TV, can you give a few examples of the type of programming these C-band satellites are providing?
So again, media customer, North America, all brand names, HBO, Discovery, Disney channels, Diamond Sports Network, Stars. Those are some names that will be using our Galaxy fleet or are using our Galaxy fleet.
And this launch tonight is flying on a SpaceX first stage booster, launching for the 14th time, and this is actually the third SpaceX launch this week. Can you talk about your confidence in SpaceX and confidence flying on a booster that's flown so many times before?
So we're extremely confident with SpaceX, and that's why we contracted with them, not only for this launch, but for future launches as well. You are right that the first stage is going to fly for the 14th time, but we looked at all the data. We're very confident. And by the way, SpaceX has flown this first stage booster even more times than 14 times for some of their own missions.
And I think you'll be back in a few weeks or about a month or so for another launch with SpaceX. Can you talk about that mission a little bit and the rest of your C-band satellites, when they're going to be deployed?
So of the 7 C-band satellites that we procured, 6 satellites are going to be launched between now and the end of the year. Each time they will be launched in pairs. So the first pair tonight, Galaxy 33, 34, Falcon 9 SpaceX, reusable launch vehicle. We'll be back next month in early November for the next launch, Galaxy 31 and 32. Those satellites have been manufactured by Maxar, and this will be an expandable Falcon 9 booster, having a little more performance for those heavier satellites. Then we have a third launch of a pair, Galaxy 35 and 36, that will be done from French Guiana. And they will be back next year for a 7 C-band satellite launch, Galaxy 37 for another Falcon 9 launch.
Jean-Luc, thank you for your time and good luck with the mission.
Thank you.
That was Jean-Luc Froliger, the Senior Vice President for Space Systems at Intelsat, the customer for tonight's dedicated launch on a Falcon 9 rocket. With the Galaxy 33 and 34 communications satellites, here's a look at what those satellites will look like once they're in orbit with their solar panels and reflector antennas unfurled. These solar panels and reflector antennas are folded up to fit inside the payload shroud of the Falcon 9 for launch. Again, these two satellites headed for geostationary orbit. The Falcon 9 will actually put them on what's known as a subsynchronous transfer orbit, a little bit shy of geosynchronous altitude, just short of the 22,000 miles altitude where the satellites will be operating for their 15-year missions, and the satellites will use their own propulsion to reach that operating orbit over the next few weeks. Here's a full frame once again of the Falcon 9 rocket on Space Launch Complex 40. You can see the frost level now rising on the first stage booster. That booster was quite dark before the countdown started this evening because it's flown to space 13 times before. Now you can see that frost from the super cold liquid oxygen rising on that liquid oxygen tank on the first stage booster as that cryogenic fluid is loaded on board. Here's a look at the countdown timeline this evening. We've already passed the first few milestones at T-minus 35 minutes. The auto sequence began, and propellant loading also began at T-minus 35 minutes. Coming up in about 2 minutes, a little more than 2 minutes, the kerosene fuel tank on the second stage should be fully loaded. And then we'll see what's known as the big vent, a vent of oxygen gas from the strongback. That's associated with the preparations to load liquid oxygen onto the second stage, which begins at T-minus 16 minutes. At T-minus 7 minutes, the Merlin Wendy engines on the bottom of the first stage will begin to be thermally conditioned for flight. That's known as chill down. At about 5.5 minutes, the first stage kerosene tank should be fully loaded. At that point, the Falcon 9 will be fully fueled for flight with 46,000 gallons of kerosene on board. Liquid oxygen loading will continue down until about T-minus 2 minutes or so. At about 4.5 minutes before liftoff, we'll see the strongback recline to its angle about 1.5 degrees from the Falcon 9 vehicle. And then at T-minus 60 seconds, the Falcon 9's onboard computer will take command of the countdown. The rocket will also switch to internal power around that time. And at T-minus 45 seconds, SpaceX's launch director will give their final approval for liftoff this evening. In that final 60 seconds, we'll also expect to see the pressurization of the propellant tanks on the Falcon 9. That's about when we had the issue, SpaceX had the issue on Thursday night that with the small helium leak that caused an automatic abort. At T-minus 3 seconds, the engine controller will give the engine ignition command to light those 9 Merlin Wendy engines on the bottom of the first stage, and if they pass a health check, hold down clamps will release to allow the Falcon 9 to begin climbing away from pad 40 at T0. So that's a look ahead at the countdown timeline this evening. Now 21 minutes until the opening of the launch window tonight. No issues that we've heard so far from SpaceX's launch control team. We're hearing periodic updates from members of the control team down just south of Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, where their launch control center is located for missions that take off from Pad 40. They have a different control center here at Kennedy Space Center for launches from Launch Complex 39A. We expect to see that big vent from the strong back in the next few seconds. And there's the vent from the strong back. This is gaseous oxygen
Stage
venting.
2, fuel load complete.
Venting from the strong back. This is in preparation for loading of liquid oxygen on the second stage. That's due to begin in about 4 minutes' time. We also heard the call from SpaceX Launch Control that the RP-1 load is complete on the second stage. This is the kerosene fuel that's going to be consumed by the second stage engine on tonight's flight. RP-1 is known as Rocket Propellant 1. It's a rocket-grade, highly refined variant of kerosene. Both stages use this kerosene fuel. So one of 4 propellant tanks on board the Falcon 9 now is fully loaded for launch this evening. In parallel with the propellant load is the loading of cryogenic helium into high-pressure composite overwrap pressure vessels on the Falcon 9. This helium is used to maintain pressure inside those propellant tanks during flight. Now T-minus 19 minutes, 11 seconds until launch this evening. If you're just joining us, you're watching a live shot of SpaceX's Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida, where propellant loading is well underway for liftoff this evening. This will be SpaceX's 46th launch of a Falcon 9 rocket this year from launch pads here in Florida and in California. It will be the 44th space launch from here at Cape Canaveral, either at Kennedy Space Center or over at the Space Force Station this year. A beautiful evening for liftoff here on Florida's Space Coast. Now T-minus 17 minutes, 20 seconds. The moon is now rising over the eastern horizon here at Cape Canaveral. You can see it rising just to the left-hand side of this wide view. On the right, you can still see the Falcon 9 rocket out on Pad 40. A nearly full moon now rising above the horizon here. It's actually just above Space Launch Complex 41, where ULA's Atlas V rockets launch from. You can see the vertical integration facility there on the left and the full moon, nearly full moon, rising above that facility. Meanwhile, on the right side is Pad 40, where tonight's launch will originate. The SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket.
On internal power.
The SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket now less than 17 minutes from liftoff. We just heard a call that the 2 spacecraft, Galaxy 33 and Galaxy 34 satellites, are now on internal power for launch this evening.
Stage 2, LOX load has started.
And the second stage liquid oxygen load has begun. This is the fourth and final propellant tank to be loaded this evening. The second stage kerosene tank has already been filled. And kerosene and liquid oxygen continue flowing into stage 1. Now 16 minutes from liftoff. T-minus 14 minutes and 12 seconds and counting. Everything continues to look very good for launch this evening of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket from Pad 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. If you're just joining us, you're looking at a live shot of Pad 40 as the sun sinks low on the western horizon, the last bit of sunlight shining on that white payload fairing and white upper stage on the Falcon 9 rocket. On the left-hand side of this wide view, you can see the nearly full moon rising off to the east over the Atlantic Ocean, just behind United Launch Alliance's launch pad here at Cape Canaveral. On the right is the Falcon 9 rocket, just for frame of reference here. And in the foreground is the turn basin here at Kennedy Space Center, where deliveries of rocket components and ground support equipment by boat often occur. T-minus 13 minutes and 20 seconds and counting. If you haven't had a chance to do so, please hit the like button on our YouTube stream. That helps us gain as big of an audience as possible for tonight's mission. Again, we're expecting to see a spectacular launch of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket just after sunset. Twilight launches are often a dazzling spectacle for those who are lucky enough to catch a glimpse of them. And with tonight's launch time set for 5 minutes after sunset, we do expect a great launch visually from Cape Canaveral this evening. Also, please consider supporting our coverage by joining our YouTube channel. Depending on which membership level you choose, you can gain access to members-only bonus video features, and you'll be supporting our coverage, helping us continue to bring you this standard of coverage that we've brought you for many years now of the ever-increasing rate of launch activity here on Florida's Space Coast. T-minus 12 minutes, 18 seconds, and counting. And also, if you haven't done so, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. You'll get alerts when we're going live with all of our live coverage. You'll never miss a launch if you subscribe to our YouTube channel. 12 minutes remaining until liftoff time. This view comes from one of our contributors, Pete Carstens, who has a long-range tracking telescope here at Cape Canaveral, showing us a view of the payload fairing of the Falcon 9 rocket. There's a shot of the nearly full moon rising over the east coast of Florida right now. Beautiful shots from the long-range tracking telescope operated by Pete Carstens, feeding us some live video for tonight's launch. The last hint of sunlight reflecting off of the top of that Falcon 9 rocket. T-minus 9 minutes, 5 seconds. After liftoff this evening, SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket will be heading due east from Cape Canaveral, targeting a subsynchronous transfer orbit. We've labeled here the locations of Space Launch Complex 40 and the drone ship, a shortfall of gravitas, where the Falcon 9 booster will be landing about 9 minutes after liftoff. The drone ship is about 400 miles or 640 kilometers downrange east of Cape Canaveral for tonight's flight. The red line shows the ground track for the Falcon 9. Most of the Falcon 9 launches from here in Florida this year have gone to the northeast for the space station missions and for Starlink missions. Tonight's mission targeting a subsynchronous transfer orbit. The two satellites on board will ultimately maneuver themselves into a geostationary orbit directly over the equator, and that necessitates the due east trajectory for tonight's mission for Intelsat's Galaxy 33 and Galaxy 34 communication satellites. Tonight's mission will be using booster number 1060 in SpaceX's fleet. It's flown 13 times before. You can see it debuted back in June of 2020 with a GPS navigation satellite, and it's flown 13 times in total. Most recently, this booster flew on June the 17th with a Starlink mission for SpaceX, and this will tie the record for most flown Falcon 9 boosters in SpaceX's inventory. And one more booster has already flown 14 times. Booster 1060 will go for number 14 tonight. And this will actually be the first commercial customer mission to utilize any booster that's actually flown more than 10 times. So a bit of a first here this evening. The first time SpaceX has utilized such a well-used booster for a customer mission and not one of its own internal Starlink flights. T-minus 7 minutes now. The engine chill down should be underway.
Stage 1, fuel load complete.
For the stage 1, kerosene load is complete, so right now the Falcon 9 is fully fueled with about 46,000 gallons of kerosene, rocket-grade kerosene known as Rocket Propellant 1, RP1. Liquid oxygen loading continues into the rocket at this time. The liquid oxygen is chilled down several hundred degrees below zero, and that will continue loading into the vehicle until about T-minus 2 minutes. Now inside of 5 minutes until liftoff. In parallel with the finalization of propellant loading.
Launch pressures.
In parallel with the finalization of propellant loading, the Falcon 9's autonomous flight safety system is expected to be verified ready for launch around this time in the countdown. This is the range safety destruct system that would essentially blow up the rocket if it veered off course after launch. And the Falcon 9 uses an automated flight safety system, so it would actually terminate the mission on its own without requiring a ground command for this action. The strong back, we expect to be. There's the call from SpaceX Launch Control that the strong back is now retracting to an angle of about 1.5 degrees from the vehicle. T-minus 4 minutes.
Stage 1, LOX load complete. Stage 2, LOX load complete.
Now inside of 2 minutes until launch, 1 minute 35 seconds, we've heard that the liquid oxygen tanks on both stages have been fully loaded. 90 seconds away from liftoff of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket. Everything looking good for liftoff this evening.
Ground gas closeout.
T-minus 70 seconds.
Falcon is in startup.
Now inside of 50 seconds until liftoff, 45 seconds and counting.
LD, go for launch.
T-minus 30 seconds.
T-minus 30.
T-minus 15 seconds. T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Engine start. And liftoff. Liftoff of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket, carrying the Galaxy 33 and 34 satellites into orbit.
And liftoff of Falcon 9. Go Falcon, go Intelsat Galaxy 33 and 34. Falcon 9 continuing downrange.
T plus 25 seconds. Beautiful, beautiful shots of the Falcon 9 rocket climbing to orbit this evening with the Galaxy 33 and 34 satellites on board. Nominal call-outs from SpaceX Launch Control, everything looking good at 65 seconds. Falcon 9 now past the speed of sound. Beautiful, beautiful shots here from the tracking camera operated by Pete Carstens. T plus 90 seconds, about a minute away from main engine cutoff of the first stage. One minute, 45 seconds into the flight. 9 Merlin engines continue firing, producing about 1.7 million pounds of thrust. Two minutes into the flight, about 30 seconds remaining until main engine cutoff and stage separation. There's MECO, main engine cutoff. We've had staging, and there's ignition of the second stage and its Merlin vacuum engine. Beautiful shot of the separated first stage booster falling away. It'll be heading for landing on SpaceX's drone ship, a shortfall of gravitas about 400 miles downrange from the Cape this evening. Should see payload fairing jettison in a few moments. Beautiful shot of the two clamshells of the fairing that have now jettisoned from the second stage. That fairing separates now that the rocket has climbed above the lower layers of the atmosphere. It is now in the vacuum of space. And that reveals the stack of satellites. The Galaxy 33 and 34 satellites are now exposed to the space environment for the first time. 4 minutes into flight. You can see the cold gas thrusters pulsing from the first stage booster as well as the payload fairing halves. Those components all coming back for recovery. Those thrusters are used to maintain attitude control during the recovery and descent. This shot showing a tight view of the first stage booster as it's heading for recovery, passing behind some clouds now. We're going to switch over to SpaceX and their feeds from onboard cameras on the first stage booster on the left, as well as a view from the upper stage with its Merlin engine firing on the right, now just past the 5-minute point of tonight's flight. See the grid fins now visible, having deployed. Wow, an amazing shot from SpaceX's drone ship, a shortfall of gravitas, showing the engine plume rising in the western sky from the view of this drone ship out in the Atlantic Ocean 400 miles away. That's where the first stage booster will be targeting landing in about 4 minutes, less than 4 minutes from now. We're still seeing views of the first stage booster descending toward the drone ship from our telescopic camera operated by Pete Carstens here at Kennedy Space Center. The entry burn for that booster stage should be less than a minute away now. Actually should be coming up in a matter of moments. Now we're back to onboard cameras from the Falcon 9 provided by SpaceX. We've seen the entry burn shut down, and the booster's next maneuver will be a landing burn, just moments before touchdown on the drone ship. Standing by for the landing burn on the first stage, the second stage continuing its burn into orbit with the single Merlin vacuum engine. We've heard verbal confirmation of the stage 1 landing burn now underway. And there's the visual confirmation. The video does have a few seconds lag from the onboard camera, and the landing burn underway. There's back-to-back calls from SpaceX Launch Control that the booster has landed on the drone ship. A shortfall of gravitas with the launch plume in the background on the western horizon. Booster 1060 has completed its 14th trip to space. Around the same time, we heard the call from launch control that the second stage engine has cut off after reaching a nominal or expected parking orbit with the Galaxy 33 and 34 communication satellites. Another shot of the full moon, nearly full moon, climbing higher in the sky here over Kennedy Space Center from the telescopic tracking camera from Pete Carstens. Now showing a view from the second stage. You can still see the exhaust plume there on the limb of the Earth. The second stage is in orbit now, 10 minutes into the flight. About 16 minutes until that engine relights. It's going to be coasting over the Atlantic Ocean, and once it crosses the equator just off the coast of Africa, the engine will relight for about a minute or so to propel the two satellites into the higher subsynchronous transfer orbit, and that sets the stage for payload deployment. 2 plus 18 minutes, 12 seconds. We're about 8 minutes away from the expected restart time of the Falcon 9's second stage engine. That's going to be about a minute-long burn by the Merlin vacuum engine to nudge or propel these two satellites, Galaxy 33 and 34, into a higher, more elliptical or oval-shaped orbit. The target for tonight's mission is a so-called subsynchronous transfer orbit. That's kind of a waypoint or drop-off orbit where the rocket will release the satellites, and then the satellites will use their own propulsion to climb even higher to their operational orbit at geostationary altitude. Now, just past the 20-minute point of today's flight, the Falcon 9 has completed its transatlantic crossing, now over the coast of West Africa. 20 minutes from Florida to Africa for this Falcon 9 rocket, now in orbit with the Galaxy 33 and 34 satellites on board.
Acquisition of signal, Gabon.
We're still hearing periodic callouts from SpaceX Launch Control that this one confirmed that the rocket is now within range of a downrange tracking station in Gabon near Libreville. Now passing 25 minutes, 30 seconds into tonight's Falcon 9 launch with Galaxy 33 and 34. We're less than a minute away, about 30 seconds away from the expected restart of the second stage engine to propel these two satellites into their subsynchronous transfer orbit. This is the orbit in which they will be deployed this evening. This Merlin vacuum engine will burn for about 55 seconds, about 45 seconds to complete this maneuver.
And back startup.
We've heard the verbal call of Merlin vacuum startup, and there is the visual confirmation a few seconds later with a little bit of lag from these onboard video cameras. That nozzle now glowing red hot for this planned burn of about 45 seconds. That engine produces more than 200,000 pounds of thrust. It's quite a powerful engine for an upper stage. So it only has to burn for about 45 seconds to do this critical maneuver to send the Galaxy 33 and 34 satellites closer to their operational altitude. This maneuver is also taking out some inclination, moving the satellites into an inclination closer to the equator for deployment this evening. A few seconds remaining in this burn now.
Nominal deploy orbit.
That burn is complete. We've heard the call from SpaceX Launch Control of a nominal deploy orbit. So the Falcon 9 has once again hit its marks tonight with this Galaxy 33 and 34 mission. We're now about 5 minutes away from the deployment or separation of the first satellite on this dual payload stack, Galaxy 33. And about 5 minutes later, we expect to receive confirmation of Galaxy 34 separation from the lower position. Here's a look at the stack of these two satellites, Galaxy 33 and 34, as they appear on the upper stage of the Falcon 9 rocket awaiting deployment this evening. And Galaxy 33 is in the upper position, as you can see here. Both of these satellites were built by Northrop Grumman. They're based on Northrop's GeoStar satellite platform. Galaxy 33 is the first to separate this evening. It's heading to an operational orbit 22,000 miles over the equator at 133 degrees west longitude. It has C-band, Ku-band, and Ka-band payloads on board, and it will be separating first this evening. A pyrotechnic device will fire to release a clamp band that actually connects the two satellites in this stacked configuration. That will allow Galaxy 33 to fly away from the rocket. And then the Falcon 9, about 5 minutes later, at 38 minutes after launch, will send the command to deploy Galaxy 34, which is a bit heavier. As you can see here, it's about 100 pounds, or about 90 pounds heavier due to some structural stiffening to support the load of the satellite that's stacked on top of it.
Acquisition of signal, HPK.
There's the call from SpaceX Launch Control that the downrange station in Hartebeestok, South Africa, is now tracking the rocket. Now about a minute and a half to 2 minutes away from deployment of Galaxy 33. And that'll be followed by Galaxy 34, which is a C-band only satellite. Both of these satellites designed for cable, television, and video relay services to cover North America. About a minute and a half now until the separation of Galaxy 33. We expect to see this, hopefully, in this onboard camera view relayed through the ground station in South Africa.
Galaxy 33 deploy confirmed.
There's the call that Galaxy 33 has deployed from the Falcon 9 rocket from the dual payload stack. And you can see in this view, if you look closely, you can see it moving away from the vehicle now. The rocket is currently flying in darkness, orbital darkness, over South Africa. About 4.5 minutes away from the time we expect to see Galaxy 34 deploy from the rocket. We should get a much better view of that event, just based on the positioning of this camera on the second stage of the Falcon 9 rocket.
Expected loss of signal, Gabon.
This spectacular photo comes from our photographer, Michael Kane, who was lined up in the perfect position to capture the Falcon 9 rocket as it climbed past the nearly full moon this evening. You can see the 9 Merlin engines, the engine plume there, the exhaust plume lit up. You can see the transparency a bit of that plume as it intersects the edge, the limb of the moon in this view. A beautiful shot captured by our photographer Michael Kane, showing this 23-story tall rocket soaring past the nearly full moon over Florida Space Coast this evening, heading to orbit with 2 Intelsat communication satellites. Kudos to Michael for this wonderful shot.
Acquisition signal, Diego Garcia.
A downrange tracking station in Diego Garcia. It's an island in the middle of the Indian Ocean and is now tracking the Falcon 9 as it continues to make its way off the eastern coast of Africa, now about to pass over Madagascar. Now less than a minute away from the expected time of deployment for Galaxy 34.
And acquisition signal, Maldives.
Galaxy 34, deploy confirmed.
And now we've had confirmation of Galaxy 34 separation a few moments ago. Beautiful shot, Falcon 9 and Galaxy 34 now flying in sunlight. And I think you can see Galaxy 33 off to the left in the distance. Really spectacular view of both satellites in sunlight, soaring over the Indian Ocean near Madagascar. A successful launch for SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket this evening. This was the 46th flight of a Falcon 9 so far this year. A really visually spectacular launch from start to finish this evening. We saw the Falcon 9 begin its climb off of pad 40 right after sunset with the full moon in the sky. You can see the empty pad here at Cape Canaveral. And then that ended with a very spectacular view of both satellites, Galaxy 33 and 34, flying free of their launch vehicle over the Indian Ocean, 39 minutes and change from liftoff here in Florida to position several hundred miles over the Indian Ocean. traveling at about 5 miles per second, 8 kilometers per second at orbital velocity. If you're just joining us, you've missed you've missed the launch of the Falcon 9 rocket, as you can see here, with the empty pad where the Falcon 9 lifted off about 44 minutes ago at 7:05 p.m. Eastern Time, or 23:05 UTC, with the Galaxy 33 and 34 communications satellites for Intelsat. These satellites have been safely deployed in orbit in a successful launch for SpaceX this evening. These two satellites are beginning 15-year missions to relay video and cable TV services across North America from their eventual perch in geostationary orbit, about 22,000 miles or 36,000 kilometers over the equator. The Falcon 9 did the bulk of the lifting for those satellites this evening to place them in an elliptical or oval-shaped so-called subsynchronous orbit with an apogee or high point just a few thousand miles below geostationary altitude. And the satellites will use their onboard propulsion over the coming 10 or 11 days or so to reach their final orbit over the equator at an altitude of 22,000 miles. Here's a view of those two satellites, Galaxy 33 and 34. Yeah, here's a view, an artist concept of these two satellites once they're on station in orbit with their solar panels deployed and their antenna reflectors deployed. Those solar arrays and antennas were actually stowed, folded up against the bodies of the satellites to fit inside the Falcon 9 rocket's payload fairing. Looking ahead for the launches over the next couple of weeks that we have confirmed dates for. Later tonight, actually, we expect to see the launch from China of a Long March 2D rocket from the Jiuquan Satellite Launch Center with the Advanced Solar Observatory. This is a solar research satellite that's been developed by the Chinese Academy of Sciences. We expect to see that launched right about now, actually, from China. On October the 9th, tomorrow, Sunday, U.S. time, we expect to see the launch of a Russian Soyuz rocket from the Plesetsk Cosmodrome. That's the northern spaceport about 500 miles or 800 kilometers north of Moscow, carrying a GLONASS navigation satellite. This is the Russian equivalent of the U.S. GPS system, providing global navigation, positioning, and timing services. The next Falcon 9 launch from here at the Cape was scheduled for October the 12th. That is Wednesday night from Pad 40 here at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. However, this launch that we saw tonight was delayed 2 days, and we believe that SpaceX has the ability to turn around launches from the same pad about every 5 to 6 days, depending on the circumstances. So we anticipate, although we haven't confirmed, that next Falcon 9 launch from Pad 40 will likely be delayed 1 or 2 days, perhaps until the 13th or 14th. That's when we have the question mark here, but we haven't confirmed that quite yet. We hopefully get that confirmed in the next couple of days. That mission will carry the Hotbird 13F satellite into orbit for Intelsat, which is a French satellite operator with its own large fleet of geostationary satellites. Hotbird 13F is a television broadcasting satellite that will cover Europe, North Africa, the Middle East for a 15-year mission life. That satellite is already here at Cape Canaveral, undergoing preparations for launch next week. Looking beyond that, on October the 21st, the next batch of OneWeb Internet satellites is scheduled to launch. We haven't talked a lot about OneWeb lately. Their launches had been booked to fly on Russian Soyuz rockets, booked through the French launch provider Arianespace. But after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that contract was essentially shredded, figuratively speaking, and OneWeb has had to go to alternate launch providers to move away from Russian vehicles, and they have booked a couple of launches with the Indian Space Research Organization and their subsidiary called New Space India Limited, as well as 3 missions with SpaceX for launches here at Cape Canaveral. The first of those 5 missions that are needed to complete the deployment of OneWeb's internet fleet is scheduled for October the 21st from India on a GSLV Mark III rocket from the Satish Dhawan Space Center on India's east coast. Those satellites have already been delivered to India from their factory here in Florida to prepare for that launch. We expect SpaceX's first launch for OneWeb here from Cape Canaveral in the December timeframe, and OneWeb plans to complete the full deployment of their 648 satellite fleet early next year after these 5 launches coming up, 3 with SpaceX, 2 on Indian rockets. So those are the next few launches that we have confirmed dates for. Later this month, we broke the news earlier this week that SpaceX is planning to launch their next Falcon Heavy rocket on October the 28th from Pad 39A at Kennedy Space Center. That will carry a classified payload into orbit for the U.S. Space Force. That'll be the 4th flight of a Falcon Heavy, which is made by combining 3 Falcon 9 rocket cores together, booster cores together. But the first Falcon Heavy in more than 3 years, since 2019. Several Falcon Heavy missions have been delayed due to payload issues, but we may be just about 3 weeks away from the next Falcon Heavy launch from Kennedy Space Center. that should be a spectacular sight with those 3 rocket cores and 27 main engines firing off pad 39A. Before we go, we want to invite you once again to consider becoming a member of our YouTube channel. If you join our YouTube channel, you can gain access to exclusive bonus video features depending on which membership tier you choose. And you'll be supporting our coverage. You'll help us continue to bring you live video coverage of events like this launch tonight, which was a very spectacular show if you're able to catch it, and coverage of future launches later this month as well. We plan to bring you those live from Cape Canaveral here in Florida. So please consider becoming a member of our YouTube channel. Also, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, and you can do that for free, and you'll get alerts every time we're going live with launch coverage. So until next time, the next time hopefully will be the launch of Hotbird 13F on a Falcon 9 next week from here at the Cape. I'm Stephen Clark reporting live from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Have a great evening.